I'm delighted to introduce the first guest lecturer for this Introduction to Psychology course, Dean Peter Salovey. Peter is an old friend and colleague. Many of you, I think everybody here knows of him through his role as Dean of Yale College. I'll just, in the context of this introduction, mention two other things about him. One is, prior to being Dean, and in fact still as a Dean, he's an active scientist, and in particular, a social psychologist, actively involved in studying health psychology, the proper use of psychological methods to frame health messages, and also is the founder and developer of the idea of emotional intelligence, an idea he's done a huge amount of research on. Secondly, Peter is, or was, an active and extremely well-known teacher at Yale College. He taught at one point the largest course ever in Yale College, a course in psychology and law, which broke every record ever had here. And before that, during that, and after that, he was a legendary Introduction to Psychology teacher. And I think you're going to get some reason for why he was so legendary with his lecture today on the topic of love.
I've got the mic on. Thanks very much. Okay. Is that okay? We're okay? Okay, thank you very much, Professor Bloom. It really is a pleasure to come and lecture to you today on Valentine's Day on the topic of love. My main area of research is human emotion, and love is an emotion. It's not one that I study personally, at least not in the lab, and but it is fun to talk about, and it is a topic that lends itself to many social psychological phenomena. It's also great to be able to come in and guest lecture. One of the things I very much miss since serving as dean is the opportunity to teach Psychology 110. And although I love being dean, I do miss teaching introductory psychology. The feeling of exposing people to ideas that maybe you hadn't heard before. Well, I suspect some of the ideas in this talk you'll have not heard before, and for a variety of reasons. A couple of the things you'll notice is that some of the experiments I'll talk about today are not the kinds of experiments that can be done anymore. They're not considered ethically acceptable, but they were done in the 50s and 60s and early 70s when ethical standards were different, and so we can teach them, we just can't give you the same experiences that some of the college students that we'll talk about today in these studies had. The other thing I will mention is that there is a certain androcentric and heterosexual quality to much of the social psychological research on romantic love. You'll see that in the experiments. Usually the participants are men, and usually the targets are women in these experiments. I'm not endorsing this as the only way to study love. It just happens to be the way these experiments were done. And so I mention this caution right from the beginning. We'll have to think about, one of the things you should think about is, do you think these experiments generalize to other kinds of dyadic relationships? And that's a question that I think you can ask throughout this lecture. Okay, so let's get started. And to start things off, I think what we need to do is consider a definition. I'm going to define what love is, but then most of the experiments I'm going to talk about are really focused more on attraction than love. Who finds each other of romantic interest that might then develop into a love relationship. But let's start with a definition of love, and I'm going to pick a definition from a former colleague, Robert Sternberg, who is now the dean at Tufts University, but was here on our faculty at Yale for nearly 30 years or so. And he has a theory of love that argues that it's made up of three components: intimacy, passion and commitment, or what is sometimes called decision commitment. And these are relatively straightforward. He argued that you don't have love if you don't have all three of these elements. Intimacy is the feeling of closeness, of connectedness with someone, of bonding. Operationally, you could think of intimacy as you share secrets, you share information with this person that you don't share with anybody else. Okay? That's really what intimacy is. The bond that comes from sharing information that isn't shared with many other people. Second element is passion. Passion is what you think it is. Passion is we would say the drive that leads to romance. You can think of it as physical attraction or sex. And Sternberg argues that this is a required component of a love relationship. It is not, however, a required component of taking a shower in Calhoun College. The third element of love in Sternberg's theory is what he calls decision or commitment. The decision that one is in a love relationship, the willingness to label it as such, and a commitment to maintain that relationship, at least for some period of time. Sternberg would argue it's not love if you don't call it love, and if you don't have some desire to maintain the relationship. So, if you have all three of these, intimacy, passion, and commitment, in Sternberg's theory, you have love. Now, what's interesting about the theory is what do you have if you only have 1 out of 3? Or 2 out of 3? What do you have and how is it different if you have a different 2 out of 3? These are what's interesting about this kind of theorizing is it gives rise to many different permutations that when you break them down and start to look at them carefully can be quite interesting. So what I've done is I've taken Sternberg's 3 elements of love, intimacy, passion, and commitment, and I've listed out the different kinds of relationships one would have if you had 0, 1, 2, or 3 out of the 3 elements. And I'm using names or types that Sternberg uses in his theory. These are really from him. Some of these are pretty obvious. If you don't have intimacy, if you don't have passion, if you don't have commitment, you don't have love. Sternberg calls this non-love. That's the technical term. And essentially what he's saying is the relationship you now have to the person sitting next to you, presuming that you're sitting next to a random person that you didn't know from your college, is probably non-love. If it's something else, we can talk about it at the end of the lecture, or perhaps when I get to it in a moment. Now, let's start to add elements. Let's add intimacy. This is sharing secrets, a feeling of closeness, connectedness, bonding. Let's say we have that with someone, but we don't have passion, that is, no sexual arousal, and no commitment to maintain the relationship. This is liking. Sternberg calls it liking. And liking is really what is happening in most typical friendships. Not your closest friendship, but friendships of a casual kind. You feel close, you share certain information with that person that you don't share with many other people, but you're not physically attractive, and there's no particular commitment to maintaining this for a long period of time. Now, what if you're not intimate, you're not committed, but you're passionate? You feel that sexual arousal. This is what Sternberg would call infatuation, and that term probably works for you too, infatuated love. And this is love at first sight. I don't know you. We've never shared any secrets because I don't know you. I'm not committed to defining this as anything. I'm not committed to the future. In fact, I'm not thinking about the future. I'm thinking about right now, but boy, am I attracted. Right? That's infatuation. And that's what Sternberg means by infatuated love. The third kind of one-element relationship is there's no intimacy, right? No bonding, no closeness, no secrets, no physical attraction, no sexual arousal, but by gosh, we are going to maintain this relationship. We are committed to it for all time. Sternberg calls that empty love. Empty love is kind of interesting. It's often the final stage of long-term relationships that have gone bad. We don't share information with each other anymore, so there's no intimacy. We don't feel physically attracted to each other anymore. There's no passion. But we'd better stay together for the kids, right? Or we'd better stay together for appearance's sake. Or we'd better stay together because financially it would be a disaster if we don't. Or all the reasons other than intimacy and passion that people might commit to each other. That's what Sternberg calls empty love. Now, what's interesting is in societies where marriages are arranged, this is often the first stage of a love relationship. These two people who've maybe never seen each other before, who have never shared secrets, so there's no intimacy, who don't know if they're physically attracted to each other, are on their wedding day revealed to each other and committed legally and sometimes religiously to each other. Right? The commitment is there, but at that moment, nothing else might be there. What's interesting, of course, is that such relationships don't seem to have any greater chance of ending in divorce than people who marry for love. But there's a big confound, there's a big problem in studies of those kind of relationships. What might it be? Anybody? What might be the problem in the statement I just made, that these kind of relationships are just as likely to survive as people who marry for love? Yes? Yeah, so they may occur, they're more likely to occur in societies that frown on divorce. They make it very costly, socially costly, to divorce. So they may stay together for all kinds of reasons, not always such good ones. All right, now, who was it who sang the song 2 out of 3 Ain't Bad? Is that Meatloaf? Who was it? It was Meatloaf. All right, if Professor Bloom says it was Meatloaf, it was Meatloaf. You're all saying there was a singer called Meatloaf? Meatloaf sang the song 2 out of 3 Ain't Bad. Let's see if 2 out of 3 ain't bad. What if you have intimacy, we share secrets, passion, we feel physically attracted to each other, but we're not making any commitments here. Sternberg calls that romantic love. This is physical attraction with close bonding, but no commitment. Romeo and Juliet, when they first met. This is often the way relationships start. We like each other. I'm physically attracted to each other. To you. I enjoy spending time with you, but I'm not making any long-term commitments here. I'm not even willing to use the L word in describing what it is we have. Right? Many of you might have been in relationships of this sort. That's romance. That's romantic love. Now, what if you have intimacy? We share secrets with each other, but there's no particular physical attraction, but we are really committed to this relationship. This is what Sternberg calls companionate love. This is your best friend. We are committed to sharing intimacy, to being friends forever, but physical attraction is not part of the equation here. This is sort of maybe the Greek ideal in relationships of some kind. All right, what if we have passion? I'm sexually attracted to you, but no intimacy. I don't want to really know that much about you. I don't really share anything of me with you, but I am committed to maintaining this physical attraction to you. Well, that's what Sternberg calls fatuous love. It's a whirlwind courtship. It's a Hollywood romance. It might lead to a shotgun wedding. Maybe you find yourself in Las Vegas and you get married for a day and a half and then realize that this wasn't such a good idea, and maybe your name is Brittany and you're a singer. Well, anyway, you get the idea. That's fatuous love. We are basically committed to each other for sex, but it's very hard to make those relationships last a long time because we might not have anything in common, we might not share anything with each other, we might not trust each other, we're not particularly bonded to each other. On the other hand, if you have all three, intimacy, passion, commitment, this is consummate love, according to Sternberg, complete love. This is how he defines love. Okay, so now you have a definition of love, and you can now, as a homework assignment, sit down tonight and make a list of every person you know by the three elements of love, and just start putting the check marks in the boxes and tallying up your personal love box score. And we don't want to collect those. We don't even want to see those. But you can have fun with that. Then you can ask the other people to do it too, and you can compare with each other. And, if you all survive this exercise, you'll be better for it. But what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's the idea behind that exercise. All right. Now, the social psychology of love really has been a social psychology of attraction. What makes people find each other attractive? What makes them want to be intimate? What makes them physically desirable to each other? What might lead to a commitment, a decision to make a commitment to make the relationship last? This is just so nice. I'm giving this lecture on love, and the two of you are holding hands here in the front row. It's really, and it's just good. All three elements present: intimacy, passion, and yeah. Okay. Good. Just checking. Okay. So what's interesting about the social psychology of attraction is it has focused on 7 variables. And I've divided these into 2 groups, the big 3 and the more interesting 4. And I call them the big 3 are 3 variables that the effects are so powerful that they almost don't need to be discussed in much detail. The more interesting 4 are the ones I'm going to focus on in this lecture because they're a bit more subtle and they may be things that you've never heard of before. But let's quickly talk about the big 3. The way to understand the big 3 is with the phrase, all other things being equal. All other things being equal, people who find themselves in close spatial proximity to each other, like sharing an armrest in a lecture, will be more likely to be attracted to each other and form a romantic relationship. Okay? All other things being equal. Now, this has been tested in lots of interesting ways. Studies have been done in the city of New York, where you can, if you live in Manhattan, you can actually get a very nice metric of how far apart people live from each other in city blocks, right? You have a nice grid pattern, and you can use a city block metric to add up the number of blocks between people's doors. And people who live more closely together are more likely to end up in romantic relationships with each other. Seems kind of obvious, right? This even works on college campuses. We can measure in feet the distance between the door to your room and the door to every other room of a student on campus, and there will be a correlation between the likelihood of, it's a negative correlation, the likelihood of getting into a romantic relationship with a person and the number of feet between your door and that person's door. The fewer feet, the more likely a romantic relationship. All other things being equal. Now, all other things being equal is a big qualifier, right? But if we could statistically control for every other variable, all I'd need to do is measure the distance from your door to everybody else's door on campus, and I could chart out who's going to fall in love with whom on the Yale campus. Now, this idea, in a way, is, I don't know, maybe it's a little counterintuitive. There's a kind of cultural myth around the stranger, the person you don't know, who you who you fall in love with, and that is not likely to be the case if it's the person who's nearby. right? And you'll see as we go through the other two big three that there's a kind of repetition of this theme. It isn't the stranger you fall in love with. All right, let's continue down. Similarity. You've probably heard the phrase, birds of a feather flock together. And that's true when it comes to romance. On any dimension that psychologists have measured in these kinds of studies, when people are more similar, they are more likely to find each other attractive. This could be obvious things like height or age, but it also could be things like attitudes toward capital punishment, preference for the Red Sox over the Yankees, right? All of these are dimensions of similarity. All things being equal, the more similar, the more likely you'll find each other attractive. So opposites don't really attract. Birds of a feather may flock together, but opposites don't really attract each other. Now, usually at this point, somebody in the lecture hall raises their hand and says, well, my boyfriend or my girlfriend and I are complete opposites. And how do you account for that, Professor Salovey? And I usually look at them and I say, good luck to you. And of course, all things might not be equal. There may be other variables at play here, but all things being equal, similarity does not breed contempt. Similarity breeds attraction. Okay? Isn't it interesting we have all of these common sayings that contradict each other, and then empirically some of them turn out to have more evidence supporting them than others. So opposites attract, not much evidence. Similarity breeds contempt, not much evidence. Birds of a feather flock together, yeah, there's some evidence for that idea. Finally, familiarity. Familiarity, we tend to fall in love with people in our environment with whom we are already familiar. The idea that some enchanted evening we will see a stranger. Where are the new blue when you need them? Some enchanted evening you will see a stranger across a crowded room. Right? What musical is that from? South Pacific. Very good. You will see a stranger across a crowded room. That's kind of a cultural myth. Of course it happens. But much more common is somebody you already know, somebody you have seen repetitively, you suddenly find attractive, and a relationship forms. Okay? So the big three. People who are similar to you, people who are already familiar to you, people who are nearby in space. These are the people, all things being equal, that you will find attractive. Okay? So those are the big three. Those are big main effects. Those are big, easy to observe in various ways in the lab. By the way, the familiarity idea doesn't just work for people. I can show you words in a language that you don't speak. And I can flash those words to you very quickly. And I can later repeat some of those words and mix in some new ones that you've never seen before. And I can say, I know you don't know what any of these words mean. I know you can't read these characters. But just if you had to tell me, which ones do you like and which ones don't you like? Or how much do you like each one? The ones you will like more are the ones you saw earlier, the ones that you already have familiarity. Even if you don't remember having seen them. Even if that familiarity was generated with such quick exposures that you don't remember even having seen anything. You will get that familiarity effect. Okay? Good. The more interesting four. These are more interesting because they're a little bit complicated, a little bit subtle. Let's start with actually the one that is my favorite. This is competence. Think about other people in your environment. Think about people who are competent. Generally, and think about people who are incompetent. Generally, we are more attracted to people who seem competent to us. Now that isn't very interesting. And it turns out that's not really the effect. Yes, we're more attracted to people who are competent than people we think are incompetent. But people who are super competent, people who seem competent on all dimensions, they're kind of threatening to us. They don't make us feel so good about ourselves, right? They make us feel a bit diminished by comparison. So what we really like, the kind of person we're really attracted to, is the competent individual who occasionally blunders. And this is called the pratfall effect, that our liking for the competent person grows when they make a mistake, when they do something embarrassing, when they have a failure experience. Okay? You can see this with public figures. Public figures who are viewed as competent, but who pratfall, who make a mistake, sometimes they're even more popular after the mistake. Okay? I think of Bill Clinton when he was president. His popularity at the end of his term, despite what everyone would agree, whether you like Bill Clinton or not, was a big mistake with Monica Lewinsky. His popularity didn't suffer very much. A lot of people in the media would describe him, well, it just shows he's human. He makes mistakes like the rest of us, even though that was a pretty big mistake. Right? And you can see this even with smaller pratfalls. Sometimes public figures are liked even more after their pratfall. Now, the classic experiment, the classic pratfall experiment is just a beautiful one to describe. It's a work of art, so let me tell you a little bit about it. In this experiment, you're brought to the lab, and you're listening to a tape recording of interviews with people who are described as possible representatives from your college to appear on a quiz show. The quiz show is called College Bowl, which I don't think is on anymore, but was on when I was in college. And you're listening to interviews with possible contestants from Yale who are going to be on College Bowl. You have to decide how much, what you're told is you have to decide who should be chosen to be on College Bowl. And you listen to these interviews. Now, what's interesting is there's two types of people: the nearly perfect person and the mediocre person. The nearly perfect person answered 92% of the questions correctly, admitted modestly to being a member of the campus honor society, was the editor of the yearbook, and ran varsity track. That's the nearly perfect person. The mediocre person answers only 30% of the questions correctly, admits that he has only average grades. He worked on the yearbook as a proofreader, and he tried out for the track team but didn't make it. So you see, they're keeping a lot of the elements consistent, but in one case he's kind of an average performer, and in the other case, nearly perfect. Now, which of these two people do you find more attractive in listening to the tape? So when they ask you questions about which person should be on the quiz show, people say the more competent person, but they also ask questions like, how attractive do you find this person? Now, you're only listening to an audio tape. How attractive do you find this person? And the results are pretty obvious. The competent person is rated as much more attractive, considerably more attractive, than the mediocre person. Okay? If this were the end of the story, though, it would be a kind of boring story. And it's not the end of the story. Now what happens is half of the participants in the experiment who have listened to each of these tapes, you only get to listen to one tape, half of them are assigned to the blunder condition. And what happens in the blunder condition is the tape continues, and what you hear is the clattering of dishes, the person saying, "Oh my goodness, I've spilled coffee all over my new suit." Okay? That's the blunder. That's the pratfall. Now you're asked, who do you find more attractive? And look what happens. Your rating of the attractiveness of the competent person grows even higher. The competent person who blunders, this is the person that I love. Unfortunately, the mediocre person who blunders, you now think is even more mediocre. Right? This is the sad irony in these experiments. The effect works both ways. So the mediocre become even more lowered in your esteem. in your regard. Now, I'll tell you a little personal story about my coming to Yale that relates to this experiment. This is one of the most famous experiments in the history of social psychology. I wouldn't quite put it up there. You'll hear maybe later about, or maybe you've already, about Milgram and maybe Asch conformity and maybe Roberts cave. Those are even better known than this, but this is right up there. This is a top 5 experiment. And it was done by Elliot Aronson, who has retired now, but for many years taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Name is not one that you need to know. In any case, I came to Yale in 1981 as a graduate student, and I was looking for an advisor.